This is Stuart. We're going to take my last project, the quiz project, which is about HTMX and using fastapi in Python, and we're going to show you how to make documentation from the Python using Sphinx, but with a fair degree of customization, which was the part that was really hard to reverse engineer. Here's where you can find the code. So I wanted documentation for my Python because that's a good thing to want. And reading the documentation tells you where you probably could have done a better job documenting the code. And I wanted to produce it in Markdown because I have a use case for that. And I want to produce it as a standalone HTML page nest because I have a use case for that. And I wanted to pick the tool that most everybody was using. Hint, it's Sphinx. But the generic Sphinx format, wow, is it not readable? But the Google style of DocStrings is super readable. So I wanted to do that, and I'll show you how for each one of these things. And then I wanted to customize the pages for my HTML content. So Sphinx and plugins, Google style for DocStrings, and customizations for HTML. And if you go to GitHub, you will see in the README, you'll see the documentation links for all of this stuff. So as you remember from last time, I put all my Python code in main.py. I know, bad Stuart, but for the demonstration, it's right sized. So the nice thing about using the Google DocStrings format from the Google style guide, and all of the links to all the things I'm talking about, you can find in the README up on GitHub. So you don't have to go scramble to find it. If I left one out, please do send me a message and let me know, and I will update the README. So for my module level thing, I just said, main module and, the header break. And I said, what is this thing? And then I wanted to document the environment variables in my main module, which brings me to quirks about lists in DocStrings as interpreted by the various Sphinx translators. So the Markdown translator and the HTML translator or generator, whatever you want to call it. And that is, you need to leave a blank line above the bulleted list title. You need to leave a blank line afterwards. And then after the list is done, you need to leave a blank line. And if you don't, what comes out of the generators is odd indeed. So to Python developers or just habitually tidy developers, this looks very blank line intensive, but it's actually required to make the documentation generate correctly. This is one of many annoyances that I will point out as we go along. So here's the documentation for a class, in this case, guest result. Using the Google notation, you say class, you say args, and the args refer to the init method for your class, so the constructor in other programming languages, and you omit self. Init always takes self as the first argument, but you don't need to, and in fact, you should not document it if you're using the Google comments style. So my init takes 3 variables and I document them, and the introspection that's done on my Python code will automatically detect and render this correctly. Here's a function example. In the nice, clean Google syntax, all I have to do is describe what the function does and give the arguments to the function and the return. If you have enabled introspection, it understands the value properties and it also understands the inferred types, in this case, the default inferences, that it's an int and that it returns an int. It's good practice to explicitly put type hints on your functions to help the introspection and generation of comments in a way that's useful. Here's another function. And again, using introspection, it understands the Python notation and what this returns, and you're just providing color commentary. So very easy to do. The introspection engine understands some of the decorators, but in the case like this, where the output of this function is cached, see more about that in the last video, it isn't the worst idea in the world to put cached in the documentation string as well. Here's a REST endpoint, which I grant you is a function. However, since it's intended to document the fact that this is indeed a REST endpoint, the prevailing style I have seen is that you put what the verb is and then the relative path and then your thoughts along with args in return. And again, it introspects on the decorator app.post pretty okay, but the output of that varies greatly depending on what the generation engine is, e.g. markup or HTML. So it's not the worst idea in the world to put some extra thought into making sure that the first line sort of expresses what this is. It just screams this is a REST endpoint. So by convention, and to keep things tidy, you should put your documentation gubbinses in a folder called docs. It's kind of what the interweb expects. So I made an empty docs folder, and then I ran the Sphinx generator and generated an empty project, which then created a build folder where the output goes. Me personally, I would have named it output, but it's named build. You can override that if you want, but then people who know Sphinx will be very puzzled as to where the output of your generation goes. And depending on what you build, builds will have different outputs. So here you can see the HTML output. And if I generate Markdown, which I'll do in a minute, you'll see that it also makes a build Markdown directory. So it makes a subdirectory for each of the generated document types. So if you have 5 of them, you'll have 5 subfolders. The configuration of what to do is in source. And this is where we're going to spend some time talking about it. The primary file for a generation is index.rst. This is the root of your generation. This is auto-generated by the thing. You can erase this comment if you want, but it is kind of nice because it memorializes that it was machine generated and when. And then the super title for your home page or, main documentation page. Here's an aphorism. And then here's another really annoying thing. So it took me a good 10 minutes to figure out how to embed an external hyperlink. Here you see the hyperlink to the README that I'm pointing you to. But it's super inobvious what the syntax is in the RST file. And it turns out that it is glaive title, and then in less than greater thans, the URL to where you want to go, a glaive, and this is the tricky part, an underbar at the end, and a space, and then a blank line on either side of it, or it acts weird. So this is going to show up on the top of my documentation output. And again, we'll show you what that looks like in a minute. And then the fundamentals are, you need to tell it that you want a table of contents tree below this text, that you want it to traverse by default 2 levels deep into your nested Python code. I wanted to show some properties that were 3 levels deep, so I changed max depth to 3. Another hint, if your output doesn't seem to contain subclasses or subfunctions or whatever, change your max depth to a higher number. Now, there's a limit to what you want to do, but 2 or 3 for most Python code is probably okay. And then you tell it what you want the table of contents caption to be. It could be anything you want. And then you leave another 2 blank lines. And I can't overemphasize this enough. If you do not leave 2 blank lines, then Sphinx will not process this file correctly. And the next thing that comes is effectively include directives, but without any kind of nomenclature or hint. Literally, you just do the default level of indentation, which for Sphinx is 3 spaces. Don't use tabs. It no likey. And then whatever other RST files I want to include in the root page of my documentation. In my case, I just have 1. Now, I hear you saying, well, you've got 1 main.py file, Stuart. What on earth were you thinking of when you put all of the documentation for main into a different RST file than the index? And the answer is two things. One, Sphinx doesn't seem to like it if you pile stuff into index. And two, if I ever added more files to this, it's so much easier to have each file have one page. And if you're tidy and each file contains a related set of items, e.g. it's a module, then your documentation will follow that. And if you make a new module, e.g. a new Python file or files, then you should make a new RST to contain that content. And when it generates the table of contents tree, it will do the right thing. And the affordances on the HTML page, like search, which again, I'll show you in a minute, or the links in the Markdown will behave correctly. But again, haha, 2 blank lines below the end of table of contents and a blank line at the end of the file, and then literally a list of all the RST files that you want to be included in the index page. If you want them to be sub-content under another page, then you would put it in the other pages RST file. So let's go look at main.rst. Okay, this is a description of the content that I would very much like to have as part of my documentation. And I wish there was some magic sauce to auto-generate this by looking at the PY and literally generating this stuff. But sadly, I haven't found one, so I did it by hand. I made each of the sections, main, classes, helper functions, etc., that show up in the output. And then in it, I put Sphinx directives telling it what to do. And the things that start with auto are the things that are part of the introspection, or you may call it reflection if you're more comfortable with that. So the directive automodule main says, I want you to go reflect on the module main and put all of the gubbinses in. Autoclass says, I want you to reflect on the class and put the gubbinses in with an asterisk. If you leave out the qualifier members underneath it, for example, line 10 for guest result, what happens is you get the class, but you don't get any of its members. So none of the properties and none of the method. And that's just annoying. For most things that are classes, you're going to want to have members. And if you want, and the introspection does a good job of identifying what's a public member and what's a private member, and either documents them or not documents them. And if that doesn't do the thing you want it to do, there is in the documentation a way of saying, don't document this thing, it's private. Here's the helper, here's a sample of a helper function. And again, I use the auto keyword, in this case, auto function. One more annoyance, it's 2 dots, a space, and 2 colon around directives, and then a space. And if you leave any of that stuff out, haha, it gives you errors that are nearly incomprehensible. And I discovered what was wrong when I went and looked at somebody else's example TM and saw all the extra spaces and went, okay. And again, the headers are just my arbitrary thing. Again, I had to write this file, right? There is no gizmo that generates it after reflecting on a Python file, which is too bad, because that would just speed the plow. You don't need to have members for functions, so you can leave it off. And you can see I just enumerated all my functions. How did I get a list of them? I grepped my Python file and looked for the word def and then copy, pasted, copy, pasted, copy, pasted, copy, pasted. And then I went through, once I had a list, and I organized them into hierarchies. And that's basically all there is to it. There's automodule, autoclass, and autofunction, because those are the top level things in Python. There are a few more, and you can go look in the documentation. So that's the RST format and its annoyances. Blank lines, haha, not optional. And remember that this format is super fussy and filled with weirdness like an underbar. So that's how to make the RST files that shape what your pages are going to look like. Let's go look at the most important file in all this, conf.py. So I took all of the comments that were auto-generated when I ran the Sphinx project initiation, and I stuck them all at the top so that I wouldn't have to look at them no more. And this is a Py file. Notice it's in Python. The document generators literally import conf.py and run all the code in here. Couple of annoyances. For auto to work correctly in the RST files, you have to tell it where the root of your code path is. And for me, it's the root of the project, which is 2 levels up from where the comp file is. Notice the comp file is in the root docs source file. So I have to go up 2 levels to find main.py. These 4 values, it asked me during the project initiation. You can go through and edit these and, life is good. But these are the 4 properties that you get out of the box. Extensions are the real power of Sphinx. So out of the box, Sphinx doesn't really do Markdown. But if you add Markdown Builder, it does. Some of these things are built into Sphinx. In other words, they're kind of UV added or, pip installed by default. Some of them aren't. When you go to run your generation and it goes, can't find blah, 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 then you need to stop and either pip or better yet, UV them on. And then inexplicably do a sync or refetch all your dependencies using pip and then run it and it'll be fine. So let's talk about what each of these do. Markdown Builder enables it to build Markdown. Autodoc is the thing that reflects on your Python to get all of the properties, types, all that happy stuff. And Autodoc is what enables you to use the various auto directives. Otherwise, these just error. So this is a good thing, and I strongly recommend it. Napoleon is what allows the parser to understand and correctly send to the generator Google-style comment. If you like Google-style comments for their ease, simplicity, and clarity, include Napoleon in your project. And then the last one is what says, if I render a straight up hyperlink, I want it to open up in a new tab. If you'll recall, in my index, I had the hyperlink. Don't forget the underbar, and the spaces are important. And this would replace whatever I was looking at. Super annoying. But if in my conf.py, I just include Sphinx new tab link, I don't do anything else, all of my absolute URLs will open a new tab, and that is a good. The next thing you need to do is tell Sphinx that it should expect Google DocStrings. Easy enough. For HTML generation, there's some hoops. Hoop number 1 is the default theme is okay, I guess. But it turns out there's a whole gallery of themes that you can go look at. Some of the themes come bundled with Sphinx, e.g. when you pip installed or UV added them, you got the theme automatically. Some of them are separate Python packages that you have to add. I like the one Cone Stack. I think it's clean and pretty. And then I want to go through and mangle the text that the default, whatever your theme you're using is going to do. So I wanted my logo, not the Cone Stack logo. I wanted my titles, etc. Inexplicably, sometimes you get weird warnings. That's what this does. So it's going to look for HTML stuff in the static path. E.g., it's going to look in source static. And you can see that I just dropped my logo SVG file into that folder. And this directive will cause this to be copied to the output folder for HTML. And that's nice. But you need to do some more hoops to get it show up on the page. So I'll show you that in a minute too. Don't change these. They're just, A, you defy the expectation of anyone who's trying to maintain your documentation. And B, there isn't really a very good use case. And so I wouldn't change these things. By the way, if there are files you wanted to exclude, and that's what exclude patterns are, and you can use the usual glob patterns like you would use for git ignore or whatever. I didn't need them in my case, but you might for yours if you have stray things that show up in the documentation or cause your documentation generation to puke, which is more likely. So this is very few lines of code, but each one of these little snippets took some exploration to figure out, which is why I thought I'd stop and make a video and just show you how I did it in real life to make your life a lot easier. Okay, time to generate some documentation. Always a good practice before you start trying to generate documentation that you clear out the previous run. And to do that, I've taken the bat file that's provided for DOS, made a PowerShell version that does all the same things. So I'm going to use the PowerShell version, but the bootstrapper creates a DOS command for doing makes. And I'm going to tell it to clean, and it will clean things out. So let's generate some Markdown. So here's the command to generate the Markdown. You don't need to remember this because, again, it's all in my README. So we'll run this. It gives me a weird error, which, by the way, I have not been able to suppress, but it doesn't seem to affect the output. And as we discussed before, the build Markdown directory will contain all the Markdown files. And we'll pull those up and look at them in a minute. I can also generate the HTML files. So let's do that. AutoBuilder not only generates them, but it opens up the results in a browser so that you can look at it. So we've generated our HTML documents, and the utility is going to serve it up to us on a port. You can change the port, but by and large, the port is pretty handy like it is. And so I can open up a browser and go to this port, and I can see my resulting HTML documentation. And here it is. So here's the index page, and then it's created a table of contents from the included RST file as well as the main file. So when you include the RST inside the index, you get a union of those two things. And they're just in different files for maintainability. And you can see that I get my hyperlink opening in a new tab. So here is all the things in the README that you need to read in order to run this, and also how to generate all the documentation and all my references and all that good stuff as I promised. And again, if I leave something out, please do drop me a note and ask me to put the reference in. And you can see that it did a pretty nice job. So if I click on main module, you get the expansion of the environment variables, you get a list of all the classes, and you'll notice that it reflected on or inferred all of the types, and it's a pretty nice format. You can see all the functions broken down into the headings that I put in my RST file. And it does a pretty nice job of, this hanging indent style documentation. Now, if you don't like this, that's great. Use a different theme or make your own. I did some customization because it transpires that for the web page, this was the template icon and this was the template name. But indeed, I want this to be my company logo and my company name. I added a little fiddling, and I'll show you how that works in a minute. We can also take a look at, here's the Markdown directory, and you get the index and you get the main. And so if I use VS Code's preview feature, I can get a nice preview of my Markdown MD. And you can see fundamentally the format's the same, but without the HTML gubbinses, or Chrome, if you want to call it that. And you get a link to the README, and indeed it opens to an exterior, and you get all of the same classes and things. You just get them in Markdown format. And when you drill into them, it jumps over to the right place and synchronizes to where you want to be. And again, all the reflection things are in here, and it's a nice thing to have. The takeaway is just a reminder that the build directory is going to have a folder per type of generation you did, plus a little overhead folder called DocTrees that fundamentally keeps track of where things are. And that's how I generate documentation. Now, the one remaining thing is, how did I customize the HTML? Well, if we look at the HTML and we go into the static folder, you can see that my logo got copied into it, as well as the default logo for the template, ConeStack. And again, praise to ConeStack, they did a lovely job. I just wanted to do my logo for purpose of demonstration. If I want to change that what I need to do is go into my source directory, go into, so, I added my logo to underbar static, and then under our templates, you can add a file called layout.html. And this will replace the default template layout that comes with the theme you're using. And there's a couple of interesting things. And again, this took a bit to discover. Once you get how it works pretty good. What does this do? Well, it says, I want to take the out-of-the-box layout HTML, and I want to add this to it. And then I want to do it by adding an extra head element and then calling super on the default template, which if you don't do, won't resolve all the other things like all your content. So this line, super critical, you not change it. And then there's an end block. And in the middle, all I did was add some plain old JavaScript that said, once the DOM has been fully rendered, and you could use the page load event if you want, but this is the one that I used. I want you to go find these two elements and replace their content as appropriate. If I'm looking at the documentation using the F12 browser plugin, what I did was I clicked on the element and I found what the path to the element was and said, okay, that's a query selector. And you can go watch videos on how query selectors work. But essentially the deal is that I got the span that contained the super title at the top of the page and replaced the content with mine. And I went and figured out that the image was inside the ID of CSNav. And I said, okay, go get it, and then update its source property to be mine, and its alt to be my text. So there's a lot of powerful things you can do, and you can play with this in VS Code and see what it does. But you'll notice that all I'm doing is essentially appending this script element to the layout so that after the page loads, it does the thing I want it to. And you can customize your page a million different ways using this simple trick. Thank you for your kind attention.